Well, good morning, folks. I'm really excited to be talking to Bryan Wolfmueller, who is pastor of St. Paul's Church, a Lutheran church in Austin, Texas, and he also has a ministry with Jesus Deaf Lutheran Church as well. Bryan, nice to see you. Thank you for giving me
Oh, yeah.
time.
Oh, thanks, Ian. Good morning or good afternoon.
Yeah, afternoon for me, morning for you. So,
Great.
Bryan, I first came across you with your fantastic online video where you gave tips to pastors for doing stuff online. And I don't know if you'll be pleased or not to know that I've been using it, passing it around. I'm trying to persuade all the clergy and the bishops in the Church of England to follow your advice, and have a microphone and
Wow.
be in the right place on the screen, and all the kind of things that you say. What kind of reaction have you had to that video? Have you had much feedback from it?
Yeah, it's been good. YouTube, and especially now, because one of the things that's happening is that, this transformation in communication has been happening for a long time, but a lot of pastors just weren't thinking about it, which is fine. They didn't have to think about it, but all of a sudden they have to, and now there's a whole set of questions, both theoretical and practical, that are that are right there in front of you, and so it's been good. What's been interesting is, some people have been really grateful just for the practical tips, like have a microphone close to your mouth. Good
Yeah.
sound is better than good video, and so forth.
Yeah, and I was really
That's
struck
one
by
thing.
that
But
point. The
just the
sound is
idea,
really significant.
yeah, it is. You could have really grainy, bad video, but if the sound is crisp and good, and the sound is, oddly enough, it's the hardest for me to figure out. I've been, a couple of videos that I've made have had, in fact, how about the day before a Palm Sunday, and then our Palm Sunday service video that had no sermon audio. We produced this video, and then it got to the sermon, and there I was preaching, and there was no audio. And I thought, oh man, here. So I'm no expert either. I'm trying to figure this stuff out, but I have, for a couple of years been working on YouTube and thinking about it. So the idea that the camera lens is a window, so you have to, you're looking through that window at the rest of the world. That's also another sort of strange thing, but maybe the most important, I think the most important thing is that when you move from one medium to another, so from face-to-face conversation to producing a video, that you gotta think about how people are going to be engaging with it. I think that's actually the most important part, but that's the part that I get the least. Guys they're just on the ground trying to figure out. I saw a meme. It was great. My wife showed me. It was one of these pastors' wives' Facebook groups, and the meme was a lady praying, and she said, "Oh Lord, please help my husband's live stream not look like an Osama bin Laden capture video." So this is just guys are just trying to make something that is not offensive, and so they need the practical stuff, which is good.
Yeah. And Bryan, those are really helpful ideas, both practically and in terms of thinking about communication. I'm really curious about where they came from you. Were you influenced in terms of doing online stuff, or was this simply a reflection of your own experience over several years?
Yeah, I've been trying to pay attention to the whole conversation for a while. I got started in new media, I suppose, doing some podcasting 10 years ago. We started this podcast called Table Talk Radio, which is a theological game show, the world's second most famous Lutheran theological game show. So
second most famous.
Yeah, some guys started one in Australia for a couple of years, and then they quit, but they're still better than ours. But
Okay.
But the idea was, a lot of churches and pastors and theologians were just capturing like their Sunday service and putting it online. They're capturing their sermon and putting it on the radio. And so they were taking something created for one space and just moving it to another space. And there's something that's lost in that. I've been doing for a couple of years these Sunday drive homes. I'm just kind of experimenting with stuff, but the idea is to take the content from Sunday morning sermon, but then just sort of repackage it in a different way. And it's an amazing thing for me to see that the sermon will have, so many engagements, views or whatever, and then the Sunday drive home will have ×3 or ×4.
Yeah.
And it's a similar content, less polished, but different, because it was made just for that thing that you're engaging in. So as many layers, and especially with new media, one of the things that's come, it's that the layers have come down. So
Yeah.
when you're watching something on the movies or TV, there's a polish there to it. There's a script. Even the sort of live stuff is so well manufactured. One of the advantages of new media is that it has this kind of immediacy to it. It has the same kind of intimacy as radio. There's no
Yeah.
script. People are just going.
Yeah.
And so to recognize that and to move into that, I think is helpful for the gospel.
Yeah.
And so I suppose it's my own reflecting on this, trying to see what's working and what's not.
Well, I think it's really interesting you mentioned the radio, because I've done a little bit of TV things, but I've done a lot more local and a bit of national radio as well. And one of the things that's really struck me about communicating, particularly in something like a pre-recorded video which you then put online, is that actually it's got a lot more in common with radio than it has with television. And I think the other thing that struck me as well is there is an intensity about it. I mean, when you're preaching in a church, in a physical context, you've got people there, you can get away with pausing, you can meander around, if you're not in a pulpit, you can wander around the platform or whatever, and you can engage with people. And actually you can give people a bit of breathing space. But actually, if you do that online, then people kind of switch off, they get bored, they're going to make a cup of coffee. I mean, they expect much more intense delivery. And I think a lot of clergy are finding that it demands more of them as well. So, I mean, one of the things I said when I was first thinking about this, and then I embedded your video in there, was to say, look, you're going to have to say things in a much more compressed way and with much more intensity and intentionality about it. I think one of the consequences of that, there is a lot of clergy, certainly people I've been speaking to, are saying that, doing stuff in video, doing stuff online is actually really hard work. It's really
Yeah,
intense and demanding on us as well.
it is. It is. One of the things that I was experimenting with the Sunday drive home was trying to flip that. One of the things,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
some of the rules of online video are what you're talking about. You don't have pauses, you don't have any dead space. You're looking always at the camera.
Yeah, yeah.
You're careful with the lighting. So when I started the Sunday drive home, I don't know, years ago, I said, what if I can do all these things wrong? What if I can move around? What if I can never look at the camera? What if I can pause and meander? And the only reason I think it works is because I'm moving around. So there's something to look at in the background. People are like, is it going to crash or what? I have like a whole internet full of grandparents now worrying if I'm going to. I tell them,
The
look,
one
if you're
thing people
watching
have said to me more than anything else is, how is he doing that driving at the same
I,
time? That's crazy.
I,
A crazy
that's,
American.
I mean, if I ever get in an accident, then you won't see the video. So if you're watching, then
that's true.
it's safe. That's
I
that's
guess
the.
so. That's kind of
But
it.
I drive safer when I'm recording like that than I ever do, because I know. I mean, I gotta be. But
People
to
are going
have
to say,
this,
hey, there's a blue light in the background.
yeah, that's right. But to have this piece, this sort of, but anyway, to your point, I think it's right. So there are rules for this stuff, but the rules in some ways are there to be broken as well. If you have compelling content, and if you've given people, the idea that they're going to benefit from enduring you, then they'll endure. If there's a payoff in the thing. So you develop this trusted stuff there. So the YouTube creators, and I'm just onto this language now, but they talk about search content and then kind of relationship content. So the stuff that you put out there that people will find you, and then the stuff that keeps people kind of connected to you. And there's a difference between those things. And but
your Sunday drive home does that very well. I mean, I was a bit naughty because I put up I loved your one on Palm Sunday about bagophanies. In the UK we would say bagophanes actually, but
bagophanes. That's probably right.
Yeah. I also, I was a bit naughty actually, because I went back and looked at the Sunday sermon, because you broadcast from the church building, and I watched that, and I had to say, I thought that the drive home was more engaging. I really did. I mean, because you weren't trying to replicate something from a pulpit, whereas you were actually in the church preaching in the pulpit. And I agree as well that the fact that you weren't looking at the camera, when you did at the beginning and the end, but that was really powerful, because for me, the moment with the greatest pathos was when you'd finished the description of Alexander entering Babylon, and then you said, Jesus didn't come riding on a horse, or he wasn't in a chariot, he wasn't in an elephant, he was in a donkey. And then you just paused. And because you were actually looking out the window because you were driving, and you just could wait. And there was a huge weight of emotion there, and you looked really caught up in the moment as well. It was very, very powerful in terms of communication.
Wow. Well, thank you. It is. I mean, so I'm not. I don't think about what I'm going to talk about. I'm just rolling these things around, and then
Mm,
I just kind of let them. I'm just kind of marinating in the stuff.
yeah.
That's. I mean, that's the idea. You know, you're thinking about this is. So I think of a pastor as like as like a prison chef. So you just gotta you have a big pot of gruel and you're just throwing in the leftovers and it's
Mm,
just simmering. And then
yeah.
whenever people are hungry, you're just scooping it out. So there's a
Yeah.
theological imagination. It's this big pot and you're just
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so you're meditating on the sermon, you're meditating on Bible class. I've been doing a lot of meditating on hope. You're engaging with all this stuff, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
kind
For
of
sure.
stewing around. And then just I think at any moment you could just jump at a pastor and frighten them, and out would come a sermon. You know,
Yeah.
it's just because
Yeah.
it
For
should
sure.
just be just right there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so Sunday drive home. One of the things that's actually been tough for me is that we've been recording our sermons and services on Friday morning.
Right.
Then I go to church on Sunday and kind of just make sure everything's okay. And then we teach Bible class on Zoom. And then I'm driving home and the
You suddenly
sermon
think of
was
all these things.
yeah, and the sermon was 3 days ago. It's just
Yeah. Yeah.
not as
Yeah.
fresh. In fact, yesterday I just didn't do it. I mean, I was thinking about and I'm like, it's not
I
it
don't know.
wasn't
No.
just wasn't right there. But
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 I think you've put your finger on something really key in preaching, though, there, Bryan, because I think all too often preachers see preaching as a task, and I think particularly for people like you and me, we're in a tradition where preaching really is about leading something out of the text. So you've got to get down to the text. You've got to do your nitty gritty. You've got to look at your Greek grammar. You've got to do your exegesis. You've got to look at the structure of the text, but then actually, as you say, what happens is it needs to simmer. And there's a creative process of creative insight. I mean, the spirit at work in us, but also simply our natural creative process. And one of the things I've always said when I've taught preaching is to say, okay, there's some digging down kind of closing down kind of work, but there's this opening up, this creative stuff. And if you leave all your sermon preparations to the last minute, you just miss out on all that.
right.
So I mean, I've always said, certainly for people beginning preaching, start looking at the text 3 weeks ahead, because
Mhm.
otherwise then you'll be going out for a walk, you're walking the dog, you're doing the garden, suddenly God will speak to you, something will come up, the passage will come back to you,
Mhm.
and which I think is a really interesting phenomenon of preaching generally.
Yeah, no, 100%. I want to make sure I just kind of hone in on one thing you said, and then maybe
Mm,
press over to preaching. But the
yeah.
the idea, so it's not a surprise at all to me that you would watch the sermon and watch the Sunday drive home and prefer the Sunday drive home. That's
Okay, good.
that's kind of
Yeah,
I think that's in
yeah,
some ways the point.
yeah.
And I normally I've never posted sermons before on
Mm,
video. I've never posted video sermons until COVID
yeah.
now, and never recorded services. And I don't like the idea of having a recorded service
Mm,
because, again, I think when you move from one place to another, I've thought of if I wanted to do something like that, if people wanted a sermon online or a Bible class online, I would get I'd build a little like studio, like the confessional studio,
yeah, yeah,
and it's like a confessional box almost. And after the service, I'd go in there and click record and say, okay, here's what the sermon was about,
yeah,
and
yeah,
do a little like debrief, or
yeah,
here's we just taught an hour and a half Bible class. Now here's the top 3 things that happened in Bible class.
yeah,
And you create a different piece of media for the
yeah,
same kind of content.
yeah.
But what this is one of the things that's changed with the corona virus is that people can't get to church. So I do want to give them something that is
Oh, good.
like coming to
Yeah,
church.
for sure.
So recording the service and recording the sermon
Yeah.
is it is meeting a particular need
Mm.
because people can't get into the building. I mean, I'm showing the pulpit, I'm showing the altar, I'm showing the people's here on purpose so they can do that. I think when this is over, it's gonna, I don't know, it's gonna look different.
Well, I don't know if you've been aware, but in the Church of England, we've had a bit of a hoo-ha about that because we're not supposed to do anything in our buildings. But I'm not going to go into that because that would involve me potentially disagreeing with the Archbishop, and I'm not going to get into that online. So you can ask me
Yeah.
about that afterwards. Um,
Yeah. But
just
on the preaching thing, I think that whenever someone asks me how to preach, I don't know how to preach. I mean, I don't know. It's one of my I should probably think about the how of this sort of stuff.
Mm,
But I've had vicars before, like interim pastors.
mm,
I think vicars would be something different over there, but
yeah,
pastors in training,
yeah,
seminarians,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and the one piece of advice I have for them on how to preach is you have to smell the text.
Mm,
So you have to smell
yeah,
Calvary.
yeah, yeah,
You have to smell the leper. You got to smell Joshua,
mm.
standing there before you got to smell the burning bush. So, and I don't know why exactly that works, but I think that that we want to sink down that we want to sink down into the text with our imagination so that we have a sort of 360 view and we can kind of look around and see what's going on.
Yeah. And I think that communicated really well when you were talking about the entry into Jerusalem. You could tell that. Now, I'm really interested that you're just quite self-effacing in terms of your understanding of preaching, because I think you read my blog post where I actually analyzed what I could see as all the rhetorical things you were doing. And there were some real classic tropes there. There was giving detailed illustrations. You're already painting a word picture. You were actually using repetition, and particularly you were using threes. You were using alliteration. So now, and I emailed you and said that was great. And you said, "Oh, I didn't know I was doing all those things."
No,
And I had a moment of panic because I didn't know whether you were being sarcastic or whether you thought I was being sarcastic. There's a funny humor thing crossing the Atlantic, but you must have had some particular influences in terms of your own preaching style. Because one of my observations was the thing that I felt made that so engaging wasn't to do with the technology. It was online, it was video, but it wasn't to do with the technology. You didn't do a fancy edit. You had one thing where you put the word up and you just said people, okay, pause and think about this. You had a nice little bit of music. But principally, the reason why it worked was because of effective rhetoric.
Yeah.
So you must have had, would you, is that just kind of spontaneous for you, or would you say there are particular influences around you for you in terms of reading about developing rhetorical style?
No, I mean, I read a lot, but or I try to read a lot, but no, so I don't have any training in this. I mean, I had homiletics classes, but I don't tell my homiletics teachers that I never thought that worked.
Right.
There's a certain sort of way that a sermon is supposed to go, and I never have thought about that. I always ask this question. I'm just, we're, as a Lutheran especially, we're trained up in law and gospel, and I want to say, how does this text convict me, and how does this text comfort me? Chiefly, how does it comfort me? And if I can get to the comfort, then I can give the comfort. So I'm always thinking, how can I teach this text or preach this text in such a way that the people say, Pastor, I want you to use that text at my funeral.
Well,
it gave me so much comfort. So I'm pressing, and I think everything deserves something different, and it's fun for me. I mean, I really love it. So
yeah, you do, and you use a lot of humor in your preaching as well.
Wow.
Telling stories and little asides. So it's clear that it seems to be clear that you're enjoying yourself as well.
There's a lot that's happening spontaneously. And so someone asked me, so I write my sermons on Sunday morning. Well, I mean, like on Friday mornings now, but
yeah, sure.
Just right before, thinking about the text, and I sit down and I put down an outline. And someone said, do you memorize your sermons? I said, well, I just generally don't have time to forget them, because if I thought of it like 10 minutes ago, I can think of it again right now.
Can I just say, if you're a new preacher watching and you've only preached a few sermons, don't follow that, okay? Don't leave it till the last minute. When you've been preaching for 10 or 20 or 30 years, like Bryan, then leaving it to the last minute is fine. But
I was at the seminary, and one of the guys asked me, he said, how do you prepare your sermons? And I said, well, let me tell you. And my professor right there said, let me tell you how I used to do it. He didn't want him to know what I did. Don't say it. But there's an immediacy to preaching. And this is maybe the thing too, for especially online media, there's an immediacy there. Now, so people use these buzzwords like authenticity and everything like this. But it's one of those things, like as soon as you say it, it's gone. Like as soon as you mention authenticity, you're not being authentic.
It's like explaining a joke and making sure it's funny, isn't it?
Yeah. Now that's an inside joke. So I should tell, on Table Talk Radio, one of the things that we have is the Wolfmueller School of Hilarity, where every joke is explained.
Oh, really?
And so it's an ongoing joke about how we explain jokes, and so that makes it. It's like
that's very good. Okay, that's very good.
But that's as soon as you say it, it's gone. Well, it's So there's something with preaching there. It's that.
Sorry, in the background there, that's my dog Barney barking. He just want to get out. So
that's great.
We might just leave that in, So it's a bit
of no, that's how it's supposed. It's talking about that's the authenticity. So Jesus comes right up to us. He just comes. The Holy Spirit has the scriptures there so that Jesus can get right in our face, and that's And that's preaching. So the rhetoric of it, I just don't think about it. So if there's something there, it's accidental,
Okay,
or
great. That's
maybe
great.
it's
Good.
just an
Yeah,
echo
yeah,
of
yeah.
something.
Well, I
But
said to you in reply, I said, maybe you're just a natural communicator. And then I didn't hear back. So that's when I was worried about
no, no,
the
no, no,
cross-Atlantic
no.
communication. So, but I'm really interested in your binary there of the comfort and the challenge. And I've said that to people in a different way. And the different way is to say, so often people look at a text and they say, oh, well, you see what Jesus did there? Well, we ought to do this. Or you see what Peter did there? We ought to do that. Or we shouldn't do this. And you end up getting with, a friend of mine once said, hardening of the auguries. And
Mm,
you end up the scriptures stop being a message of grace. And actually, if you focus on what has God done, what has God done in this text? What does God want to do through this text to you? How is God offering his grace to you in this text? Rather than saying, what must you do when you go home or when you leave the building? Then I think,
right.
again, that's that balance between the comfort and the challenge. Can I
No,
just take you back in it?
yeah.
Sorry, did you want to say any more of that?
No, that's so I grew up in the evangelical. Well, I grew up in the liberal Lutheran tradition, and
Mm,
then switched over to the evangelical tradition,
mm,
and then
mm,
became a Lutheran again. Came back around to the confessional Lutheran side of things, and that's one of the biggest things I notice is when you read the Bible, what question are you asking?
mm.
And I've got my old Bible, and I just I'd read the Bible and say, what does this mean I should do today?
Yeah, yeah,
And if
yeah,
you
yeah,
ask
yeah,
that question, then that's what
yeah,
you're going to get. You're going to get
yeah.
all
A
law.
list of things to do.
So then you ask the question, well, what is this teaching me about God? And then you get
Yeah,
theology,
yeah,
and then you
yeah,
say, how does this deliver the forgiveness of sins?
yeah,
That's what St. Paul says in Romans 15:4, that the scriptures are written for our comfort and our hope.
yeah.
So how does this
Mm,
give me peace? And when I ask that question of the text,
mm,
then it just comes flooding on me. And
mm,
there's something too to recognize s- that the Holy Spirit is bringing the word of God to us now.
mm, mm,
So, for example, when I we had Good Shepherd Sunday. I think you guys probably did too last week. And
yeah,
so reading John 10,
yeah,
and it just starts with the words of Jesus. So you want to introduce the text, and it gives you a little gloss, and it says Jesus said.
yeah.
And I never say that. I'll say Jesus says.
Okay.
This is
Yeah,
now
yeah,
it's a present. Jesus is now here
yeah,
speaking.
yeah,
Jesus
yeah,
says. Now sometimes you got to say Jesus said, like this generation won't pass away, or
yeah,
like
yeah, for sure.
go and do whatever you do quickly. You don't say,
Mm,
but the idea that this is the Holy Spirit is bringing the text to us, and there's an immediacy
mm,
between me and the text. I mean, the text is a mediated thing, but there's an immediacy between me and the text, and between the people and the text. And
mm,
so we're not preaching about Jesus.
mm.
We're not preaching about what Jesus has done. We're not just, there's not a layer there between between the Holy Spirit and the ears of the
Yeah,
people. That's
yeah, yeah. We're not standing back and offering a detached commentary. We're actually involved in part of that process. But I
right.
think, again, coming back to the situation we're in currently, that does seem to present us with a particular challenge because, as you say, there's an immediacy and there's an engagement. But of course, we're just looking at the little window of the
Mm.
camera. So we actually have to have that discipline of thinking of the little camera on our computer as a person in the congregation that we're engaging with. And that is quite a hard skill to develop and to sustain, I think.
Well, it's really, so things are, I think, are going to flip a little bit now, because
Uh-huh.
one of the very curious things that I noticed when I started doing podcast and radio stuff is that, and even video, is that a lot of creators in these fields are very introverted. That
Ah, okay.
they like being, and you can do it with, you sit here with a microphone, and there might be 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 ears on the other side of the microphone, but all I have to worry about is the
Mm,
microphone.
yeah, sure.
There might be thousands of people watching, but I just have to worry about the little camera there. And
Mm, mm,
so for introverts, there's a freedom that this kind of
okay.
creation gives. For extroverts, it's really tough. Who get energy from being around people in a room.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so most pastors have that.
yeah,
They get their energy and their adrenaline
yeah,
from shaking hands before the service,
yeah,
and
yeah,
looking out at the people. And
yeah.
so it kind of, there's a kind of a flip in the energy and the momentum.
It is.
So
I've just had to do some teaching, and it was on quite a challenging subject. And I'd have stood up and done 3 hours interacting with the class and no problem at all. But to actually pre-record on video, it was absolute agony. And it took me once I got my material ready, it took me 7 hours to get this thing down because it was just so hard to get into that mindset of saying I'm actually trying to engage with people here. It's really tough. But
and you
can I
can't
just
see if people are falling asleep or
no,
if
you
they're
can't. No, no,
laughing,
no,
or
no,
you
no.
just got to assume.
if they're being offended and hating what you're saying, and want to come put their hand up and say, no, you're wrong, which of course in class they could do, you know.
Right. That's right.
But that provokes me to ask you, I mean, you said you did podcasting about 10 years ago and you've been doing some YouTube stuff. So what was it that drew you into online media anyway, in the first place?
It was kind of an accident. I just got invited to be on a couple of show. Issues Etc. was one, and then Table Talk started. I always thought that to have a theological game show would be a lot of fun, kind of a twist. And so I had a friend of mine at the seminary, Evan, who's still my partner on the radio show. And I told him about the idea, and he wrote it up as like an evangelism class project proposal. And he called me up one day and he says, I got an A on the project. Maybe we should try it. So, but I suppose I like to experiment. And one of the things with this revolution in technology is it's made the barrier to entry so low, so that you can experiment with very little cost, and you can try something with very little cost. When I started working with a YouTube channel probably 4 years ago, doing a little Bible study called Grappling with a Text, which it wasn't even at me, but the camera, I had my camera facing down on
so people really were engaging with the text.
Right. And it wasn't even, a lot of these Bible studies were doing the kind of the online screen stuff. And I wanted to, kind of experiment with the retro. So I would I'd have a piece of paper and a pen, and I would be drawing on there's my hands, and there's a wooden desk, and it's the new media.
And you still do that. I noticed instead of editing your things, you hold up a little bit of paper with the heading on it instead of using online PowerPoint. Yeah, well, why not?
Yeah. And I made some sort of vow. I don't know if it counts as a vow, but some sort of thing at the very beginning where I said, I'm gonna, if this gets very difficult to edit and do all this sort of stuff, I'll just get bored with it. So you make it easy. So for 2 years now, everything's been on the phone. Every video, every recording, the editing, the posting, everything on the phone, so that it's possible. Now COVID has sort of forced me to get better cameras and better gear and do all this other stuff. And but I don't know how long I'll be able to endure it, but the idea, so you can try something and then you get immediate feedback. It's an amazing thing. We started Sunday night, I started a contest, theology contest. And so I'll give a question every week. People tag it with their hashtag and put it up there, and I'll pick the best. And I have no idea if it'll work or not, but I don't need to have like a committee to figure out if it is. I mean, I just made I made a note card with the hashtag on it somewhere. It's hanging around here. And I just made a video while I was taking out the garbage and posted it up on YouTube. And I got, 50 hashtag back. And so we could just try it. And if it works, it works. And if it doesn't, then you just try something else. So if you can have we should probably be serious about, remember that G.K. Chesterton line where he says we have a hubris reversed. We should be very sure of our theology and very unsure of ourselves. We should have this kind of lightness with which we take ourselves. So this gives us that opportunity to take our theology seriously, but ourselves, we can take lightly and try to serve and bless in different ways.
Just staying with that question, I mean, I'm really fascinated to hear what you think. I mean, obviously people have said there's lots of negative about the current situation. So obviously it's really tough for people on their own. I mean, we're in a household of 7, and I've got a nice garden I can use. So, so-called lockdown doesn't really make me feel isolated. But for some people, this is really challenging. In some churches, it's really challenging. I know some clergy who are really struggling with getting their heads around technology. And also, of course, members of congregations. I mean, those who are happy being online and so on are finding, there's lots of stuff going on, but others are really struggling with it. But in terms of positive changes, what do you see as being really positive out of this in terms of what are congregations learning, what are churches learning, what are individuals learning, what are ministers, pastors and clergy? What do you see as positive coming out of this so far?
Yeah, I sent out a weekly newsletter to just a group of people who are interested. It's just free kind of thing. And I did a survey, and I said, well, I asked a question a couple of weeks ago, what do you think Jesus is teaching us with this crisis? And I got about 400 responses. Amazing. Wow. The thing that came back was 2 words: repentance and appreciation. So, and I think, and I think if you can combine them together, we'll know better in a couple of years, or maybe in 10 years, we'll be able to look back on this. I mean, I think it's such a big event, a big
Yeah.
moment in history that we'll be reflecting on it for a couple of generations. But that there is a way that, we think that tomorrow's going to be the same. And we shape our hopes and our expectations around this idea. And Jesus has reminded us that no, that control that you think you have is an illusion. The security that you think you have is an illusion. So that the false gods will eventually show themselves to be false. So all the things that we clung to, that we trusted, and so forth, all of that it fades. And but Jesus does not. His word does not. It stands. So I think that's the big theological lesson. And I think there's an advantage also for resting. I think that there's a retreat that, so like in the Middle Ages, if you were just living in the Middle Ages, you had the kind of castle or the city with the walls, and then everyone lived around it and where the fields and farms were. But in times of danger, everyone would retreat to the walls. And so in this time of crisis, we see where the walls are. So the idea of a one world, that people pull back to their countries now in some ways, and people pull back to their families, and they pull back to their local communities. And so you get to see where the walls are, and that's helpful for us to recognize.
And on the first point, you said something similar in one of your drive homes. You said that, and it's interesting because you tried to remember the phrase you used. You said that today is not yesterday's future. It's not the future you thought of in the past. Didn't you use some phrase like that?
Yeah, something. I did. I couldn't remember how it went.
Yeah. We'll have to rehearse that a bit more.
The present is not the past's future. So you have all these things that you think are going to be the future, and then you get there, and you're like, wait a minute. But we have the Lord with us. I mean, that's so.
And of course, that's exactly what the letter of James says, where he says, you've got plans to do this tomorrow and go on this business trip and do this thing. You fool, it'll all go and it'll be rotten, because you don't actually know the future is going to be like that.
The Lord just seems to really delight in saying, "Oh yeah, you got some plans."
Absolutely.
Now, what do you think, Ian? I'm interested in your reflections on this, and then I have another question for you, actually. On this.
Are you going to turn the tables? Okay, yeah. I think part of me thinks that the person who's going to tell you what the future is like is a fool. The story about I think it was the president of Olivetti, the typewriter manufacturers, who said at one point in the 1960s, I think the world is going to require a total of 4 computers. And he didn't mean 4 computers per household. I think the future is genuinely unknown. I think I would love to see really good things coming out of this, both in society and in ministry, in the church. I think one of the things we're really encouraged about in the UK is the fact that, as you say, the threshold for engagement has been lowered. So, a lot of churches here are seeing the numbers of those attending, as it were, online are much bigger than would be attending week by week. And the church I belong to, St. Nick's, is in the city centre of Nottingham. So we draw from around the city. I think one of the things we're seeing is seeing people come to church more often, because I think a lot of people, they've got busy lives. And actually nowadays, out of 4 Sundays, they might be there 2 or 3 times, even some of the most committed. Whereas, 20 years, 30 years ago, if you're a serious Christian, you went to church twice on a Sunday. But it's interesting that when you don't have to drive into town, you can just sit at the end of your kitchen table or whatever, then you haven't got the same excuse. So I think we're seeing a greater degree of engagement. I think my anxiety is to say that a lot of people say, both in terms of ministry and in terms of society, they're saying this is a great opportunity. Look, we don't need to do with all the traveling around. It's going to be better for the environment and so on. I don't know if you know that in China, their levels of emissions of greenhouse gases has already returned to pre-COVID levels.
Wow.
And people are not going to want to travel by bus and train. So that's just one example of saying, well, this moment will lead to change if we want it to lead to change. And I think the same is true in terms of ministry. So people are engaging with the gospel, engaging and hearing the scripture preached, and engaging with Christian fellowship. So the question is, when this period comes to an end, things might change if we want them to change.
Yeah.
If we're going to respond in the right way, which enables the changes people have made to endure, and not just to be a little blip, just a little moment.
No, that's great. That is really one of the difficulties that I've had is I've been trying to figure out where to where to find out how people who don't know Christ, how they are handling this whole thing. So, I mean, there's got to be communities where that's happening online. I'm just not part of them. And I can't go down to the Starbucks, or I can't go down to, we have a university campus close to the church, and I just kind of go down and talk to people in these places. And I can't do that now. So like my means of access to those conversations is cut off. So I wonder what's happening. I mean, I wonder how, because we know that the gospel, the wisdom that comes from above, is helpful in this situation. So we want to be helpful to people, but we, in some ways, are just hoping that they'll find us. Because how do you go? Jesus says, go into all nations. So I know that, hey, I can travel over to England and go and try to find the pagans there or whatever. You can travel here and find the pagans here, but how do you go into the internet?
Well, one of the things you can do is to have porous boundaries. I mean, one of the things that I do on Facebook is that most of my connections on Facebook are through church and Christian faith, but I also try and foster ones that are either on the margins or people are not. And that's interesting to, they listen into my conversations and I can listen into theirs because we're friends. I say, I think one of the things to do is to go into a public space. And the question is, where are public spaces now? And I think they're in those kind of internet forums. So those are the places to live. But one of my other reflections is that challenge. I mean, one of the challenges for us in the Church of England is the challenge of invitation. Someone did a survey a couple of years ago, and they surveyed regular attenders of the Church of England, and they said, would you be willing to invite a non-Christian, non-church attending friend or family member or neighbor to come to church? And I won't ask you to guess the percentage who said they would. It was low. It was.
I imagine you're not boasting about it.
It was It was 17%.
Wow.
So the challenge there is invitational. Now, I was talking to some clergy and diocesan leaders last week, and we did a kind of a webinar on what's happening now, what's going to happen in the future. And a bit of me said, well, these things are changing, this is going to be different, this is the particular challenge, the big financial challenges. I said, but a bit of me feels as though, what the challenges we've got now, they're actually just the same challenges that we've always had. So, okay, in real life, would you invite someone to come to church? Well, if not, you're probably not going to invite them to come and look at online church either. And if you were going to invite them, you probably will invite them now. So at one level, that challenge of invitation, of engagement, it has maybe a different form now, but I'm not sure that in essence it's a different question. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, 100%. 100%. And there's two problems there. I mean, there's one is, well, maybe three. I mean, one of the very interesting things I've been thinking about is that, so the Anglican Church, the Lutheran Church, both are kind of so we expect people to be in families and not just chiefly as friends. And so one of the things that, like the younger evangelical churches, the first generation churches, they expect people to be chiefly friends, young singles and things like this. And so the way that friends communicate versus the way that families communicate is very, very different. So like we see the evangelical churches and we're jealous that they have so many young people, that they're so engaged and stuff like that. Those are people at a different time of life. Now, we should probably just be aware of that and treat people both as members of family and also as in their friendships. So that's the thing. But then we say, so why don't people want to invite? And it could be two things. Number one, they're just afraid, and so they need courage, or they don't know what to say, so there's ignorance, so they need knowledge. So we can provide those sorts of things. Or it could be that there's a way that the church is answering questions that they know their friends are not asking. Now that's what I'm particularly interested in. If the church can answer the questions that the culture is asking. I mean, it could be the culture is asking wrong questions, and for that we could say, well, you're asking this question, but this is why it's wrong. So you need to ask this question. But if we can understand the questions that the culture is asking, and I think that's what we mean by relevant. I do not like that word relevant. I don't even like the idea of it. I mean, as soon as you say it, it's like authenticity too. It's gone. It's
well, gone. A good friend of mine says instead of using the word relevant, he likes to use the word resonant. So you may not be exactly answering the question that people are asking, but something in what we say actually resonates with, the way they see life, and there's a connection there, which I think certainly resonant is a better word than relevant.
I'd like that, and that there's a consistency to our teaching and our preaching as well, so that people know that they're going to come and there's going to be something helpful that we're actually really blessing people. This is what Jesus wants to do through the church. He really wants to bless people. He really wants to grab a hold of them and forgive their sins and welcome them to eternal life. That's what he's doing.
Yeah. Now, just looking to the future, things obviously are very different in the present. I sense that when this period ends, whether it's going to tail out over a long time, or whether it's going to come to an abrupt end, I could imagine that for different churches, there are going to be two different reactions. One is some people will say, let's get things back the way they were as quickly as we can. Let's get back into church. Let's ditch all this online stuff. Let's do, they'll be desperate for the reassurance of doing things the way that they were always done before. But for other people, they're going to say, no. We've learned a new way to do things. We've got to stick with the new stuff and not simply go back. Maybe it's too personal to say, where do you sit in that spectrum? But maybe the better question is to say, what is there in the new things we've been doing that we can take alongside reestablishing some of the old ways? I mean, I think that actually physically meeting, for example, physically gathering, as a Sabbath discipline weekly, I think that's a kind of a non-negotiable of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, a member of his ecclesia. But the question is, what from this era, what do we take into what people are talking about the new normal? Have you had any thoughts about that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about that constantly. I mean, so number one, especially for the Lutherans, I think that Lutherans are unique in this way. But you guys, we might be, we might have a shared theology here. Is that you don't have the benefit of the Lord's Supper unless you take and eat the body and the blood. So you got to be. There's something very physical,
material about that gathering and about sharing.
You cannot escape that. So the weekly gathering for the Lord's Supper and the weekly gathering to hear the preaching, that cannot go away until Jesus comes back. I mean, there's just no way around it. So that has to happen. The kind of swirl of busyness that surrounds our lives, both in the church and in school and work and everything else like this, all those things have been cut off. And then you start to say, now, well, what don't we miss? So it's like, the prophets always talked about the shaking, like the day is coming when I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. So the kind of shaking, and if something's sturdy, it stands. And if something's not, it falls over. So this is a kind of a shaking. And I think a lot of the stuff that's on the edge will fall away. A lot of the organizations that were created back in the 50s and were just kind of legacy sort of things will say, well, we can, it will be okay to not do that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and some of those won't withstand the financial changes as well, I think, in the next few months.
I think there'll be a lot more sympathy for the homebound, basically for orphans and widows, because people have realized what that means. And now they've had a little taste of it themselves. So I hope it increases our sort of our awareness, our compassion for the people who are always under quarantine. So hopefully that happens. I think that the idea that online and that everybody can do, I mean, all now, someone said like the week after the lockdown happened, a friend of mine says, now every pastor is a YouTube pastor. He says you got now you all of a sudden have competition, which is great. I mean, so that we can do that and lower the barriers, because it is a big commitment for someone to come into the church building. But can they watch from a distance and ease their way in? So all these are good things. That's
great. Well, Bryan, it's been really fantastic to spend time with you. Thank you so much for your conversation reflections. I found it really stimulating, and I'm sure other people will do too. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for reaching out and for the kind words and for inviting me on. And we'll do it again sometime. And we'll
that'd be great.
This is fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.